This is Brenna Quigley, your personal geologist and terroir guide. Join me on a road trip through the geologic history of your favorite wine regions around the world. This is Roadside Terroir. Hello, and welcome back to Roadside Terroir, Season 3, Farming for Terroir. This two-part episode series on the intricacies of farming philosophies is brought to you thanks to the wonderful team at Becky, Wasserman & Company. If you're interested in sponsoring an episode, donating to support the show, or becoming a Roadside Insider, check out our website, roadsideterroir.com, or shoot us a message directly at contact@roadsideterroir.com. Let's get started. As always, don't drink and drive, and remember to keep your eyes on the road. This episode contains explicit language.
Okay, let's try now. Pronto.
Beautiful.
Okay, we're all set. Okay. Fantastic.
This feels
That's the best Italian organization I could offer to you, which is the worst.
I'm so appreciative. I know you have harvest right around the corner, and it's not an easy thing to coordinate. So thank you so much.
Absolutely. It's great that we made it happen in a moment of excitement on both sides. So you'll get to grasp the energy of the moment and with all that it comes with.
We're beginning our conversation today with the fabulous, brave, and brilliant Chiara Pepe, the third generation of Emidio Pepe in Abruzzo, Italy. Emidio Pepe is adored by everyone from classic connoisseurs to natural wine cool kids, and for good reason. Chiara began to take over the reins of this beloved domain in 2020. I met her right around this time when she was studying at the wine school in Beaune, Burgundy, and like many others before me, was instantly drawn to her enthusiasm and infectious passion for farming and winemaking. Chiara and I had been trying to coordinate this conversation for literally months, and the stars finally aligned just as she was about to enter Harvest 2025, which she's now right in the thick of. Though Pepe was already considered to be a pioneer of natural farming and winemaking, Chiara was immediately ready to make some big changes, with farming at the top of her mind. Can you talk a little bit about the farming methods or philosophies that you follow, right? So you're organic. Are you certified organic?
100%, yeah.
And you always have been?
Yeah, since 1998, yeah. So not always, but since the certification came out, we did.
Okay.
I am not certified biodynamic though, and I don't have other certifications. We've been slowly adapting and slowly navigating towards fully biodynamic, regenerative kind of approach. And then everything that I am replanting right now, which is very little, but it's been taking a lot of thought and a lot of excitement, is again in pergola, but with the system of agroforestry.
Over the course of the past couple of episodes, we've attempted to set the stage for this big, complex season about the connections between farming and terroir. We have, so far, discussed why farming matters, why we care, and how we might taste it in the glass. But as we get into these conversations, I find myself squirming uncomfortably with the details of all of these terms. How can you do all of these things at once? How could you be certified in biodynamics, which prides itself on its mystical, philosophical nature? What exactly is agroforestry, and does it really work to plant vines in a forest? Or is it planting a forest in a vineyard? In order to do this conversation justice, the Roadside team set out to define and organize some of these key farming terms. And to start off, I spoke with Paul Wasserman, a sponsor of this episode and, in all honesty, the only person who could convince me to get this whole project started in the first place. Paul has also found himself fascinated by the world of farming as the producers he works with continue to up their game and present him with new and exciting innovations, oftentimes faster than he can keep up with.
It matters tremendously. And it matters a lot to me because a lot of our growers are incredible farmers. And in the last decade or so, it's taken on a whole new dimension that did not exist. Certainly when I was a teenager growing up with Becky, things were more simple back then. But lately, a lot of people are doing a lot of extraordinary things, and sometimes not the same things. And it's important to note that because farming and wine is often too discussed as a soundbite, and not everything works everywhere. It's very dependent, obviously, on terroir, which is why I guess we're having this conversation with you particularly, but also dependent on climate, dependent on the age of your vines, the vigor of your vines, your soils, your equipment, how expensive you sell the wines, on your team, how big you are, all of that. It's very complex. I feel a little awkward talking about it. I come from it as an armchair groupie of farming because of the extraordinary people we work with.
Paul and I are both interested in really understanding the nuances and realities of these farming methods. By working closely with a diverse group of growers, Paul is acutely aware how many details and decisions are involved. At the current moment, farming is as in vogue as it ever has been.
And so we need to really think about how we farm if we're going to be able to farm for tomorrow. There's the famous Saint-Exupéry quote that says, "We do not inherit the earth from our parents, we borrow it from our children. And if we don't pay attention, we're not going to have very much to give to our children." So wine is not an essential food product. What wine can bring to it is that it's an agricultural product that can at times sell for a lot of money. So it can afford to take farming very seriously. And if it's very expensive, it should do that. It should be one of the 10 commandments of producing hyped up or expensive wines is thou shalt farm like a dream, you know? But it's not always the case.
But as we're finding out, these things are not so cut and dry, and not everyone has time to get a full-on viticulture degree while trying to pick out a bottle of wine for their Tuesday night dinner table. So as a result, we as consumers, buyers, and sommeliers have started to cling to certain terms. Sustainable, lutte raisonnée, organic, biodynamic, regenerative, and the little stickers that their governing bodies bestow upon the bottles that follow their rules.
I guess to say that the boxes we put farming in, the sound bites we put farming in, are insufficient. You have some certifications. The one for organic is very clear. It's mostly about not using chemicals. And you have several for biodynamics, but worldwide mostly Demeter. And it tells you also that you can't use chemicals. And it has extra steps with the biodynamic preparations and composting, which are looking at soil health, except that it's such a wonderful universe, biodynamics, that you almost hoped that more would be in the certification, more regenerative and biodiversity. Then with regenerative farming, unfortunately, the certifications are in their infancy, and there's a lot of hope for them, but apparently there are only 50 wineries that are regeneratively certified, and so that's not going to help you on a broad basis to find regenerative wines. And then, of course, there are the people that are not 100% organic or biodynamic, and there's a strong argument that maybe in some cases, organic and biodynamic are not the most ecological way to fight things like severe fungal disease pressure. So, in a way, I haven't uncomplicated things, but certainly insisted on the fact that farming is complicated and you cannot put it in those simple boxes.
Our original plan for this episode was to, once and for all, sit down and define the most important farming methods and certifications. But almost as soon as we set out to do this, we realized that there's actually a lot to unpack before we get to definitions.
I think it's all very personal, with a lot of debates among different factions, but even amongst friends that see things the same way. I'll give you some personal things that don't come into the discussion of farming very often, but say you're a new domain, you need equipment to farm properly, and that takes time to finance. If you have loans and you have a crop to save, well, maybe fully organic is not the answer. Sure, there's philosophy in it. There's really profound convictions from all of them. There's your individual thoughts about what is ecological is a big part of it. As an example, 2024, mildew up here, black rot maybe down in the Rhone. This year, for example, people did somewhere between 5 and 10 treatments, anti-mildew treatments. I spoke to some people in 2024 that did almost 30. So if you're on clay soils that are highly compactable, are 27 passages with a tractor that are going to use fuel, is that the ecological decision?
This all got me thinking about just how much of this conversation really is a philosophical conversation. If we're going to provide definitions for these farming methods, should we be reciting the rules and regulations required by the certifications? Or is this a bigger conversation about moral responsibilities and political convictions? So I started to look into the idea of farming as a philosophy, and it immediately became apparent that my scientifically trained mind was completely inept at grasping these less tangible concepts.
You know the expression from Plato that described to Socrates, and there are many different versions of it, but the first step is recognizing that you don't know. And so I would say, first of all, you're one of the least inept people I can think of in this field. And second, you're in an even better position because you recognize how much you still need to learn.
This is Abe Schoener of the Scholium Project and the Los Angeles River Wine Company. We'll actually visit more with Abe later on in this season in his very cool urban winery along the train tracks of downtown Los Angeles. But today, I'm just calling in a favor. Our whole conversation was entirely unplanned. I didn't even have time to get him a mic, and he was incredibly generous to spend nearly 2 hours patiently breaking down some philosophical basics while he himself was also gearing up to begin his own harvest in the deserts of the Cucamonga Valley. Abe's philosophy expertise greatly predates his winemaking expertise. He graduated from St. John's College before obtaining a PhD in philosophy at the University of Toronto, and eventually returned to St. John's as a professor and later dean of students. It wasn't until several years later that he would ultimately give it all up to become a harvest intern at Stag's Leap Cellars in Napa Valley.
So that was the first year of my sabbatical, and I had really limited, highly circumscribed responsibilities. I did fermentation monitoring, and I was really only allowed to pull samples out of valves, put the sample into a cylinder, float a hydrometer in it. And in many cases, I wasn't even allowed to add the wine back to the vessel that I drew it from because of the danger of inoculation. I had a real openness to everything because of my desire to learn. So I wasn't even offended that I wasn't trusted to put the wine back in the top of the tank. But I did ask why this really basic thing was judged to be beyond my abilities. And I think it was Michael Salacci, who was the head winemaker, who took the time to explain it to me. And he said, because some fermentations will have been inoculated for malolactic fermentation and some will not. And if you pull a sample from an inoculated tank and by mistake put it back into an uninoculated tank, that tank will become inoculated. And it made me realize that I was now working in a realm that was so different from the realm that I had been in graduate school when I was teaching at St. John's, a realm where there were real binary divisions And there was no gray area between the two binary poles. Either a tank was inoculated or it was not. And I had never worked in a realm like that before. And all of the work I had done at St. John's, in all of that work, you could talk your way through anything. And the realm that you navigated in, like the medium in which you were swimming, was a medium that was anything but black and white. It was only gray. And so at most, you were moving through shades of gray, but never moving through two poles with nothing in between them. And so it was amazing to me to now suddenly be in that kind of realm. So farming is like that too. And one of the difficulties in even talking about something like the philosophy of farming is because it is fundamentally a practical exercise, and there really are right and wrong answers. And I think of the experience that we've been having with Raj as all of us are learning together as he took over the farming at Phelan Farms and is trying to shape it into his own vision that probably corresponds to a philosophy, is that there are simply true and false situations, and there are approaches that work and don't work, and there's no confusing working and not working, and there's no way to talk yourself or to talk anybody else from a situation that isn't working to one that is. You're really confronted by the facts separate from what you might consider your philosophy or anything like that. Because in a certain sense, farming is almost like weather forecasting. You get it right or not. And your position could be super interesting. If you don't get it right, who gives a shit how interesting your position was?
When you're in the business of growing a living thing, caring for that living thing must be, in some sense, your primary goal. If the vine dies, you've failed. End of story.
There are a whole bunch of overarching decisions that one could, loosely speaking, call philosophical decisions. You could say it is my philosophy to farm organically. You could say it is my philosophy not to till. It is my philosophy not to irrigate. And what you mean when you say philosophy is you mean that it's a really high-level governing principle. And maybe you mean that you have an articulated, thought-through set of reasons behind it, but maybe you don't. And it's really interesting that the word can serve both purposes. So let's take tilling, for example. It's kind of interesting to me how heated the debate has become about tilling in viticulture. And I think to some degree, the heatedness is misdirected. And this would be an example of where philosophy has trumped something practical, where I think that a more nuanced view driven by something like facts and figures in the farm in question could be more important than what's called the philosophy. And I know vineyards that have been damaged by the commitment to not till them. And maybe, I don't want to say that the not tilling was like poisoning them or something like that, but it made everything else that was going on in the farming of the vineyard more difficult and maybe less successful. And I think irrigation is the same thing. And maybe until a year or so ago, I might have said something like irrigation is never good and should always be avoided. And if a vineyard has been established with irrigation, one of the most responsible things one can do is to commit to a gradual program of weaning it away from the irrigation. And that's a pretty reasonable approach. But I think maybe even that approach is too dogmatic. And I feel like I'm now sliding away from that, what you might call philosophy of never irrigating vineyards.
I asked Abe to pause here and explain how he suggests we can approach the topic of farming from a philosophic perspective.
Plato and Aristotle are both really good, what you might call anchor points. They represent to me what you could call almost diametrically opposed approaches to philosophy, but they're both, I think, really helpful for just asking the question, what does it mean to think philosophically in general? What would it mean to think philosophically about farming? So Aristotle was a kind of logician, and everything we have of his is kind of dry and subject to logical analysis. There are very few metaphors. There are for sure no poetic figures. They're always arguments. The arguments are based on careful distinctions. I think that to use the expression, think philosophically about farming in an Aristotelian way would mean to have a set of principles that you could articulate, and that you'd have the ability of moving from those principles to actual steps in the vineyard, and you could draw the connection between the first principles and the steps in the vineyard. And one example of that could be the commitment to not tilling. And then you have a whole bunch of other things that follow from that. But in order for that really to be thought through in a philosophical way that would satisfy Aristotle, you'd have to be able to give some articulate explanation of why you're committed to not tilling. His teacher is almost exactly the opposite. Plato didn't write any handbooks. He wrote plays. And the plays have discussions within them, and the discussions have arguments, and the arguments are very articulate. But very often they're hardly rational at all. They involve all kinds of what you might call tricks, appeals to the emotions. There's an extraordinary use of metaphor, absolutely extraordinary. There's a lot of what you might call poetry. So to say that you're going to think philosophically about farming and mean it in a Platonic sense, I think that really allows for the possibility of poetic flights, of not being able to give well-articulated, reasoned accounts of things. And maybe all you can give is a really powerful metaphorical account. And what's interesting is I think both of them can lead to really good results in the vineyard.
So can you elaborate a little bit on the difference between a philosophical viewpoint versus a dogmatic one?
So for me, a philosophical approach, as opposed to a dogmatic approach, would always be one that has a fundamental openness, but that also is articulated at the same time. In other words, it's not a mere list of these are my beliefs. There has to be some system connecting the beliefs and allowing you to give an account of why belief X results in practice Y. You have to be able to give an account. It has to consist in something more than, I think it's the right thing to do, or I was brought up that way, or something like that. A dogmatic approach could be as well articulated and as well reasoned as the philosophical approach, but the difference is that fundamentally it's not open. Something has been closed off. I don't think there's anything wrong with anybody using the expression, it is my philosophy to do X vis-a-vis a practical activity. The only thing close to something that I think is wrong is dogmatism, is an unwillingness to examine something. And I think what's interesting is very often people in English use the expression philosophy as cover-up for dogmatism.
From my very novice understanding of things, it almost seems like the Aristotelian method of philosophy is kind of practical. So there's almost kind of like a meta question of thinking is philosophic, can we actually separate this idea of philosophy and practicality? Or
yeah, these are really, really good questions. And I would say, deep down as a teacher, my view would be, in a certain sense, they should remain questions. And it's not that anybody should try to answer them, but nobody should try to offer an answer. So if you and I were having this discussion in a classroom at St. John's, it would be great for everybody, not just to listen to it, but to be part of it. And I wouldn't expect anything like a majority of the people in the room to leave with the same position at the end of the discussion. I would expect almost the opposite, that it would have the effect of awakening questioning in people.
As I continued to listen and learn from Abe, he expanded on his ideas about the current philosophical work he's doing as a winemaker. He discussed how Nate Reddy has advanced in his farming at Hayu Wine Farm to a point where he can take philosophical flights of thought.
But here, philosophically doesn't mean should I till or should I irrigate? It means something like, what's the difference between air and earth?
He also discussed conversations he's had with the great Pascaline Lepeltier about how philosophers use rhizomatic networks to understand the world.
So for me, it is super interesting to bring these questions to bear in relation to grapevines. And then to think about this other question, not necessarily related to rhizomatics, but related to roots. And that is just to think about the difference between above ground and below ground. And I have the opportunity to think about it both in a practical way and also in what you might call a philosophical way. And that's, I would say, is the beginning of my present philosophical work in this realm, to try to think about something like the metaphysics of the below ground as opposed to the metaphysics of the above ground. And I think that that's something that Chiara Pepe is also both thinking about explicitly out loud, and also that her philosophical reflections are having a bearing on her farming and vice versa. In other words, practical things that she's seeing and doing in the vineyard are affecting her philosophy and vice versa.
Abe and Chiara are friends, and there are so many parallels between the way Abe thinks of farming and Chiara's practical and philosophical implementations at Pepe. At times they're aligned, and at times they're not, which both of them value.
Well, I'm honored in the first place because I consider Abe a mentor in so many different ways. What I can say within what's happening in Abruzzo and more specifically at Pepe is that I'm going through a learning journey that is specifically more visible and more of a roller coaster under the agronomic and farming point of view, which is something that since I took over in 2020, I felt a very strong responsibility for. More than anything else, we are in a very precise historical time within never before farming has been such a relevance for the planet's future. So I feel that responsibility, and I embrace that responsibility with pride and optimism, knowing that I can contribute positively to what I can do.
Soil health is clearly a top priority for Chiara. After doing her own research, she returned to Pepe, determined to stop tilling. But as she got to know her vineyards and began to recognize the challenges unique to Abruzzo, she found herself questioning her own beliefs.
It is not that, I was like, hey, we don't plow and none of the parcels are going to get plowed any longer because I don't like plowing. I don't like the sound of the tractor and everything that comes with it. So like CO2 emissions and sequestering carbons are being released, and everything that I believed, it wasn't actually functioning for every soil. That wasn't working on every parcel. So I had to give up on the moral responsibility of my belief in order to work alongside the specific need of every single parcel. So I needed to build up onto a more structured soil and a more autonomous soil, a more aerated soil before I could take certain liberty. I could take also certain risks and still do the best that I could for every plant. And then the other very important aspect that is related to why we do things in a certain way is also related to what do we give the highest priority to. Is that making fruit that is going to be making the most memorable wine? Is farming for future, which means little by little building soils that are sustaining themselves without external help? Or are we trying to create an ecosystem within we love to be, but probably is not going to be making the most memorable fruits for the most memorable wine. You have very little details in within the why we do things in a certain way, and why do we decide to put energies in a very specific direction. So the reason why we do certain things is going to drive us to a very specific result, and not all decisions are colliding towards one big goal.
How do you think those things are at conflict with each other?
All right. On a very, very practical element, I can say. And this works for Pepe, right? So this is not universally true, but this is my experience. If you want a very strong, healthy fermentation, you need to have high level of nitrogen, that it's assimilable in the mast. It is historically valid that if you plow before harvest, you're going to liberate nitrogen and you're going to enrich most likely your masts with available nitrogen for your fermentation. Is that something that you want to be doing for your soils and for your landscape and for your biodiversity? No, that is not. So when you take the decision of not plowing that clay before harvest, you know that you'll have to pay so much more attention to those fermentations, and the risk you take, it's higher and needs more presence and has a higher risk. So you take that into account when you make that agronomic choice. So yeah, not all the decisions are like aligned for me to the same goal. And of course, I think that magic equilibrium might be arriving after decades and decades and decades of solid farming that is extremely attentive when you need to build up an ecosystem that works in synergy and it's stable in within itself.
Chiara is the perfect example of someone carefully weighing their own strong opinions and viewpoints with the practical realities of farming treasured vineyards that represent her family's legacy.
The idea is to explore volumes as much as I can, so that if I try to go higher and occupy more volume in within what is visible, I know that I'm exploring deeper sides in within my soils. So the idea of growing cover crops and vineyards on pergola, which they are 2 meters tall and they develop horizontally, and then above that, cultivating trees that can reach higher and higher volumes. Basically, you know, the roots are going to be on the same size of everything that is visible. So in order for a soil to function, has to be in the colloidal state. Colloidal state is brought and kept by humidity. We can do the best farming we can, but if it's so dry that you lose that humidity, the soil will just stop functioning. So the water is incredibly important for what we're talking, and specifically for soil health and soil functioning. And this, if we want to face it, this is also going to be explaining the reason why in winter 2024, I decided to install irrigation on 60% of my vineyard. Of course, I know I'm walking on eggshells because it's very hard for people to understand the way I'm going to be using water and the reason why I'm going to be using water and why farming well, it's not enough, that I cannot retain enough moisture into my soil. So that also went again, the moral values that I had around farming. But I think, and I understood that there is a limit to that. So I had to put the moral value that I gave to that a little bit aside. And I said, if I want to be achieving and improving and making my soils evolve, I have to make sure my soils are moist for most of my year. So I had to put my pride, my farmer pride aside, and I said, hey, it is time for you in central Italy to install some irrigation to make sure your soil keeps being functioning throughout the whole season.
In California, irrigation is commonplace, even among some of the most responsible farmers. In many parts of Europe, particularly in Burgundy, where Chiara went to school, it's not only illegal, but pure blasphemy.
Okay, so it seems like your biggest challenge present day, like today, is the lack of water in the form that you're used to getting it.
Correct.
And it seems
and timing.
Yeah, the timing and form. And that's a new thing for you that you're dealing with.
Correct.
And it's great. It fits in perfectly to the conversation that we're having about kind of thinking philosophically about how you're farming versus dogmatically. And it's cool to see you making this kind of huge shift in what, probably what you thought you were willing to do, because it follows a greater philosophy of what you want to do.
Totally. Back in the days, my grandfather used to struggle much more with disease pressure compared to what I have to struggle with right now. Especially mildew pressure was huge back in the days compared to what we have right now. And also the challenge of back in the days was ripening. And back in the day, he was even forced to put on his label vino da tavola, table wine, because his Trebbiano was not reaching the 11% alcohol in order to claim the appellation. So, of course, in between my grandfather and I, we are 60 years apart, almost, roughly. And you can tell how 60 years have been impactful in within we think wine, in within the concerns we have. So it is incredibly precious to have that point of view and to understand his concerns. Also the wines that we're making, which inevitably are going to be very different.
Yeah, that's kind of fascinating. It's almost like you're experiencing this like functional shift in climate from changing what your limiting factors are, like from changing like your concerns about mildew pressure and ripening to a shift in, and I think what you're saying about the soils, shutting down is you're saying you're going to experience a loss in fertility because of the drying out of soils.
I've been seeing that already. Yeah. What is happening, and one of the reasons why irrigation was important is that a lot of the plants were physiologically suffering from consecutive years of drought. Mm-hmm. And I couldn't stand still and watch my old plant die and not do anything about it.
Mm-hmm. Right. Okay, so this is a hypothetical question, and so maybe it's stupid. If things were changing in the other way, and you were seeing an increased threat of, mildew pressure or disease pressure, mm-hmm. would you consider not being organic?
No, because It is not 100% necessary to make wine, but it's 100% necessary to farm. If you want to farm, you got to be farming virtuously. I would never do that. We don't have to make wine at all costs. Do we have to make a positive impact on the planet at all costs? Yes. It is not worth to be making wine while destroying the planet. Because we have to say, that is also happening. Industrial viticulture is all over the world. And we cannot afford that any longer. Makes no sense for me to make wine at all costs if you know you're not going to be improving your soils.
I think what we've learned so far is that when used appropriately, farming philosophies represent the overarching principles, or as Abe might say, the high governing principles that dictate the countless choices, both small and large, that go into growing a single grape. From a practical standpoint, Paul Wasserman must consider these distinctions carefully when choosing the growers he works with.
I think it was a very basic moral question 10 or 15 years ago. It was like, let's move to plowing and lutte raisonnée, working the soils, using chemicals only when necessary. But today, the science, the available information, the technology is crazy good. I was recently talking to Thomas Boulet, and he said what most people say is your circumstances sometimes dictates your farming. And very clearly, the price you can set your wines at will allow you or not allow you to do some things. So, yeah, philosophy, your moral values, your ethical values, but there is imposed on all of this a very pragmatic reality.
Are these things that people are debating heatedly, or are these things that are more collaborative discussions amongst friends?
It's all of it. Farming grapes well is incredibly hard work. And if you get a stressful vintage, it's psychologically painful. Like when you face losing your entire crop. And sometimes you lose your entire crop and you still have to work the vineyard for the next year. So it's horrific. Just a few days ago, the vintage was looking really good in Côte d'Or, but there was, a stretch of a few days of really warm weather, and it turned in a few seconds. In a day or two or three or four, you can completely lose your crop or change the entire character of a vintage. It's psychologically taxing, hyper stressful. So to go back to your question, sometimes it's debated very harshly, yes. Also, there's this, if you have the badge, the certification, if you can promote something like no-till that's fashionable, there's annoyance at hype and buzz. But overall, the people who farm well exchange a lot and do different things and talk about it. There's a lot of mutual respect in the farming, at any rate. So you get it all. You get yelling matches. You get jealous people that actually damage the vines. That happened in Meursault recently. Literally cutting vines. Tomoko and Guillaume, people cut their wires off in the Chauray vineyard because they'd raised the canopy, and some jealous person just, destroyed their work. So there's a spectrum.
By nature, we haven't come to a definitive answer about how to think about farming philosophies here. But I do hope that we can all think a little bit harder about our own values when it comes to the things we're consuming and the things we're supporting financially. And to encourage openness and discussion and just giving a damn about all of this beautiful complexity over simple sound bites. Wine is a luxury, so let's treat it like one.
So it's looking really good. We're looking at an era of very, very interesting farming, the appearance of new technologies, the melding of a lot of different influences, different techniques, technologies. And I think if the climate doesn't jeopardize everything, we're looking at the best era of farming we've ever seen, or certainly I've ever seen.
This has been part 1 of a 2-part series on farming philosophies. We'll be back with part 2 on October 3rd, if you can pry yourself away from the life of a showgirl. In part 2, we'll investigate and break down each of these major farming methods from both the certification perspective and the greater philosophical perspective we've gained today. In the meantime, we'll be back with another new episode in just 2 weeks. That's September 19th, with a one-on-one farming deep dive with a fascinating grower and producer we've come to adore in the past few years. Thank you for listening to another episode of Roadside Terroir. We're so grateful you're here. This thoughtful episode is brought to you by the incredibly thoughtful team at Becky, Wasserman and Company. Thank you all so much for your support and everything you do to encourage pushing the boundaries of farming throughout our industry. Thank you to our guests, Paul Wasserman, Chiara, Pepe, and Abe Schoener. If you're enjoying this season, we'd love to hear from you. Send us a message, or even better, give us a rating or a comment on your chosen streaming platform. And don't forget to tell your friends. If you want to support the show, please consider becoming a Roadside Insider or donating to help keep the farming content coming. You can find out about all of these options and more at our website, roadsideterroir.com. We'd like to extend an extra special thank you to our Grand Cru patrons, Stephen and Amy Lippin. Thank you. Roadside Terroir is hosted and produced by me, Brenna Quigley. Sound engineering, original music, and sound design by Jeff Alvarez. Thank you to Paul Knittel, Claire Shaheen, Isa Islami, and everyone else who helped make this episode a reality.
Pronto, 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 pronto. Pronto, 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 pronto.
Check, 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 check. Pronto, pronto, pronto. Pronto, pronto, pronto.